I'm Ezrah Raya, and this is the Manila Times. More than 10 years ago, when Super Typhoon Yolanda, international name Haiyan, struck the country, leaving at least 6,000 dead and millions homeless. Today, while most businesses have recovered and flourished in Tacloban, Leyte, the most badly hit area by Yolanda, many still remember the horrors of strong winds and massive waves that crushed the coastal community. The climate walkers left Manila on October 8 for a month-long journey on foot, heading to Tacloban in protest for climate justice. Climate advocates believe that the government has not done its part to protect its citizens from extreme weather events. Here with us today is the co-chair of the Energy Working Group for the Philippine Movement for Climate Justice, Attorney Aaron Pedrosa. Welcome to the Manila Times, sir. Sir, last November 8 marks the 10th year since the deadly Super Typhoon Yolanda struck the country. And PMCJ is one of the organizations that completed the Tacloban March on November 8 in commemoration of climate victims. Do you think the government has done its part in addressing climate resiliency?
Well, that is one of the objectives of the walk, to highlight the continuing demand for climate justice at a time when what we are witnessing is more of the lack of response from the officialdom or from both the national and local government. The idea really was to put a spotlight into the injustice suffered by the victims of Yolanda and the injustices that may still happen and occur in our generation, in our lifetime, should inaction continue on the part of the government.
Sir, the deadly storm, as we remember, left thousands, at least 6,000 people dead. So what do you think can be improved in the country's climate status 10 years after Yolanda?
Well, it seems we haven't learned, or at least the government hasn't learned its lessons, or the lessons after 10 years since Yolanda struck. Imagine when Yolanda devastated most of the Visayas region, the Yolanda corridor, as we said, global warming was at 0.88 degrees Celsius. A decade after, we are now looking at a breach of 1.2 degrees Celsius. And this is still consistent with the projection climate science. We are seeing the worsening impacts of the climate crisis. Well, because of the climate crisis, because of Yolanda and many other weather extremes and slow onset impacts, the order of the day should have been, one, to realign government programs, projects, and resources in ensuring the survival of community, boosting the adaptive capacities of our communities. But we're seeing none of that. For instance, and to be concrete, we do not have a national plan on or to address sea level rise. The Philippines is vulnerable to sea level rise. We are next to the rapidly and the fastest rising ocean, which is the Pacific Ocean. Ironically, the government does not have any plan. We do not have a master plan to address droughts. We do not have master plan to address the devastating impacts of weather extremes of Yolanda, twice, 3 times stronger than what 2013. Instead, we are looking at, and then our indication, General Appropriations Act last year and this year, at government projects couched as climate projects, when in reality these are just infrastructure projects which do not contribute to boosting our adaptive capacity to be able to respond to catastrophes arising both from weather extremes and slow onset impacts. So there's a great deal of a gap, veil of a difference in terms of what is required for us to be able to address our continuing vulnerability to climate impacts and what government is doing.
Sir, regarding going back to the victims of the Yolanda Super Typhoon 10 years ago, so when your organization went there, So what is the life like of Taclobanons there now compared to 10 years ago nung sirang-sira yung lugar nila? So what does it look like right now? Were they helped and were the infrastructure that was destroyed replaced?
You know what, Ezra, I'm also from Tacloban, and our house was destroyed by Yolanda. We belong to the same district as the most devastated, if not one of the most devastated in Tacloban City, the San Jose district. Entire second floor of our house was blown up by the strong wind, and the first destroyed because of the combined deluge of water from our nearby river and the water from the storm surges coming from the sea. What we've been saying, a year after Yolanda, we've seen businesses building back and better, but we have not seen the same change in terms of the most vulnerable, the poorest sections of the community. In fact, what used to be fishing communities are now cleared, you know, they're no longer there. They have been relocated, most of them anyway, into the resettlement areas, far from their livelihood. Of course, the Tacloban City government has done what it could do to cushion the impact, including organizing routes to communities who are now in the mountain barangays of the city compared to before when they were just in the heart of the city. And that would, of course, entail costs, which are challenging at a time when incomes remain stagnant or alarmingly low, you know. Uh, Taking note that Eastern Visayas is one of the poorer regions in the country. But business has recovered, no? We've seen establishment blossom, bloom left and right, but the same could not of the poorest section of most of Eastern Visayas. And this is true not only for Tacloban. We have D1 in Eastern Samar, areas in Ormoc, other areas in the rural areas of both Leyte and Samar. So that's why every now and then we'd ask if there's recovery, is what kind of recovery? Recovery for whom? Take note, the entire idea of recovery is to be able to not necessarily restore the communities to how life was before, but to be able to ensure that they are able to adapt given the changes or the changing times. Uh, Whether that has happened remains to be seen, but from our communities, from the areas that we have been assisting since right after the narrative remains that they haven't recovered still in a manner that should have recovered compared to the businesses.
Sir, I hear you, as one of the victims of Super Typhoon Yolanda 10 years ago. As you said, your house was destroyed. Let me ask you this. Were you able to rebuild? And how much of the people of Tacloban was able to rebuild their homes and are living better lives now, 10 years later?
Just to briefly walk you down memory lane, when the government provided assistance, there were two categories rather. For houses or homes which were permanently damaged, there was an allocation of 30,000 pesos. For homes which were partially damaged, there was an allocation of 10,000 pesos. Uh, our home was totally damaged, but according to my aunt, I was not there at the time. I was in Manila attending a conference, whether that was fortunately or unfortunately. We were able to, we were provided with the 10,000 assistance, no? Barely enough. It barely scratched the surface. This was our ancestral house, and the cost was staggering. That's why this was the narrative, the how people romanticize resiliency, that the Warainons or Filipinos in general are a resilient lot. Really looks at, if you probe deeper, it is resilience sans the government, without government. We couldn't wait for the government to provide for the needed relief, for the needed assistance, because even the local government unit was devastated. The national government unit seemed lost at the time. They didn't know how it would proceed with the rehabilitation efforts. So we were left to fend for ourselves. So much so that, given the scarcity of resources, the income, despite me being a lawyer, no, uh, um, we weren't able to rebuild our home in the same scale as it was before the typhoon. But the house still stands. Just a major renovation, and no thanks in big part to the government. And the same is true for many of the homes across the Yolanda corridor. Take note that the government initially estimated close to 500,000 homes for resettlement for those who have been permanently displaced. And later they adjusted the target to around 200,000 homes for the most severely affected. And that hasn't reached 100% 10 years after Yolanda. You could look at the accomplishment rate or completion rate even. It's a little over 50% of what was targeted in 2014 under the Office of the Presidential Advisor for Recovery and Rehabilitation, or OPAR.
Just to repeat what you said, sir, as you said, as one of the citizens in Tacloban, most of the victims from the typhoon, from the Super Typhoon Yolanda, has not recovered yet, even a decade after the storm. And moreover, so there are no plans yet for climate resiliency in the area as well. So that's a very sad story to hear, sir. So climate change seems to be a huge thing to tackle for the Philippines, even just for Tacloban. So what do you think are the steps that must be taken in order to reduce or cushion the impacts of climate change?
Yeah. Before I answer that question, just to further clarify, our assertion is there isn't any real recovery and meaningful recovery along the Yolanda corridor. And by recovery, we mean being able to address the pre-existing conditions of vulnerability. That would include poverty, the lack of opportunities, the lack of the much needed support in terms of social services. Because the idea is to build back better if we use the government slogan. But we are nowhere near better. Providing focus rather to programs, projects, even finances, the resources necessary, mobilizing them to ensure that all of these address our continuing vulnerability to the climate crisis. On the other side, that would also mean rethinking and ultimately abandoning business as usual projects, programs, and policies, such as, for instance, the continued reliance on fossil fuel technology and burning, or reclamation projects, or the destruction of our remaining carbon sinks across the country. Because as a country in the front lines of the most vulnerable to the climate change impacts for the last decade, the Philippines is consistent in the top 5, if not top 3. The preoccupation of the government is to preserve what capacity we have to be able to address both the slow onset impacts, just like droughts, sea level rise, and extreme weather events like Yolanda. And we have been reminded when 9 years after Yolanda, Odette struck and took on the same path as Yolanda. Take note that our experts have said that when Yolanda struck, they were not expecting another kind in the same strength or magnitude as Yolanda to happen until the turn of the century. Yet in 9 years, another typhoon in the category of Yolanda struck again in the same pathway as Yolanda, devastating much of Cebu. So this is the kind of mobilization of government efforts that is required at the moment to cushion us from the worsening impacts of the climate crisis.
Thank you so much for your insights, attorney. As like you said, there must be mobilization from the government side to protect and cushion its people from the effects of climate change, especially extreme weather events, because we would never know when another super typhoon might hit, and hopefully not soon.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time, the co-chair of the Energy Working Group for the Philippine Movement for Climate Justice, Attorney Aaron Pedrosa. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Ezra. Maupay ang kulog.